Good morning, everybody, and a special good morning to our guest this morning, poet Sally Reid. Good morning, Sally.
Good morning.
Sally joined us last month from outside Rome and spoke about the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins. But today, a special edition for Mary's birthday. Sally has come all the way to England, not quite to the studio, but to Suffolk, where she's going to be speaking to us about her literary memoir, The Mary Pages, which includes reflections on Mary and Sally's own relationship with Mary, and then also looking at some of Sally's own Marian poetry. So it's such a gift for us today, Sally, to have you helping us get deeper in our relationship with the Blessed Virgin Mary, and also getting to know you a little bit more. So a very warm welcome.
Thank you. I'm really pleased to be here today on the Virgin Mary's birthday. That's really special. And yeah, I'm going to be looking at my book, The Mary Pages, and also some poems, as you said. And I thought the best way to begin was just to read the first page or so of The Mary Pages, because it will set the scene a bit. And the book is really about how Mary was this constant presence in my life from the very, very beginning, long before I converted, because anybody who knows me or my work will know that I converted very dramatically in the space of 9 months, from atheist to Catholic in 2010. And I wrote my book, Night's Bright Darkness, about the conversion because it was just so dramatic. And then some years later, I sort of realized that the Virgin Mary had been present in my life from the very beginning, which was so strange because my family isn't religious. But my grandmother was an Anglican, and she was kind of banned from talking to me about religion, really. But she had pictures on her walls, and the Mary Pages it looks a lot at Marian art and how Mary comes to us through paintings, and how those paintings can be very flawed and very subjective and very strange and sometimes even blasphemous. You know, Chris O'Feely, who did a sort of portrait of Our Lady made out of elephant dung. And the book looks at a lot of these paintings in depth and covers a lot of Marian art, and how it kind of interwove and interweaves with my own life and spirituality. So I'll begin by just beginning with the very first page of the book. I first saw her in my grandparents' house, a luminous oval in the darkness of an oil painting. I'd lie on the settee in the afternoons with nothing before me but climbing on hay bales and soft-boiled eggs for tea, and look at her. I didn't marvel at how her skin glowed like olive oil. I didn't know olive oil. I couldn't have begun to consider the genius of painting folds of blue fabric and shadow, not to mention light and thought and all of that. She just was. A part of the wallpaper of the child's world that is indistinguishable from earth and sky. The baby in the painting was easier to see. He was bonny, with a full-on gaze, and lit, just like his mother. But back then, it was the woman who harnessed my attention. Her light seemed to emerge from thick night. I had no way of looking directly into her eyes. She was somehow less important. But without her, the baby would not be there at all. Around the house where I lay in such glorious idleness, there was no landscape to speak of, just acres of grey sky. The trees resembled dissected lungs for most of the year. The crows made their large black nests in them. I saw the path before me in the deep tread left by my father's boots, in the slime of wet leaves and the milky clouds of breath. As we walked, churches swung into view like ships in a flat brown sea. Their graveyards were stuffed with lichened graves. Often, the village around them had been wiped out by plague. There was nothing of Mary in those churches, though many were named for her. The shrines and niches were empty. On one whitewashed wall hung a large black iron wheel, utterly detached of meaning. Hundreds of years before, it would have been spun by the sexton to determine which of the Virgin's feasts a fast should begin or end. But there was nothing and no one to explain this. The ornate black circle looked, to me, incongruent and mysterious, as if it belonged to the ghostly carriage my grandfather swore he saw outside the church one winter's night. How many glimpses of Mary I must have had without even realizing it. In my infancy and youth, she was my Old Testament. She foreshadowed the coming of Christ himself into my life. There was no God in my own home, no prayer. There was only an injunction to kneel to no one and nothing, and a right-sounding insistence that I would grow up to be successful and strong. But I saw that oil painting, an imitation of Raphael's Madonna del Granduca, on my grandmother's wall. I knew the name Mary, as I knew the names of chaffinches, sugarbeet, and lily of the valley. When I scrambled out of my grandmother's spare bed in the morning and looked out at the fields of charred stubble, I could have seen her, as the scripture says, sitting at the gate. Hers was the hand that would lead me slowly to her son. Yes, it makes me wonder how many hints and traces of Mary there is in everybody's life. Because Mary is the most painted woman in the world. And even when the Reformation came along and destroyed the churches and the shrines and all the rest of it, those paintings were mostly conserved. And in the Mary pages, I go on to talk about how when I went to London and was leading a sinful and frivolous life, as it were, in my days off as a nurse, because I was training to be a nurse, I would go to the National Gallery in London, and it was almost like my church. You know, it was a place to go where I could be completely quiet and just kind of be with my own thoughts. And as you wandered through the National Gallery in London, you quickly stumble upon rooms and rooms and rooms of paintings of the Virgin Mary. And it's a kind of a whirlwind tour of art, and also how we view the Virgin and how she's kind of developed with us in our consciousness. And I found that incredibly intriguing right from the very beginning of my life, when I really wasn't at all religious. I remember looking at the icons of Cimabue and Giotto, and how flat they were and how seemingly lifeless. And yet there was something in their eyes that seemed, they say that icons are like windows, and it really was as if there was something else that would lead me in. And then as you go through the centuries of Marian painting, she becomes kind of more fleshy and more full, and she becomes more like a real woman in a sense, more like an ordinary woman, I should say, not real, more like an ordinary woman. And at that point, it's often the artist using his lover as a model. So, for instance, there's a very famous Caravaggio called La Madonna dei Pellegrini, and she's this very tall woman with this beautiful red dress and her head kind of on the side, and she's just muscular and sensual and earthy. But the model for that painting was a woman called Lina, who was Caravaggio's lover. And in the Mary pages, I look in detail at the story of the Italian painter Fra Lippi. And Lippi was a monk and a priest, and he was also a philanderer. I mean, in those days, lots of people became priests who perhaps shouldn't have become priests. I'm sure that's sometimes the case today as well. And Lippi went to do a painting for a convent of nuns in Prato in Italy, and he encountered this beautiful nun called Lucrezia Buti. And he just fell hook, line and sinker for her, absolutely loved her. And he asked whether he could use her as the model for Mary. And so he began to paint her. And those paintings of Lucrezia Buti as Mary are some of the most sublime Marian art that exists in the world. But now the underside to that story is that Lippi became so obsessed with Lucrezia that one day in August, the story varies depending on who you read, but he basically kind of kidnapped Lucrezia and took her away to his apartments, and they lived together, and she bore him 2 children. Now, I've read quite a lot about this, and it kind of seems to me that she fell in love with him too. She had 2 children with him, and she would willingly have married him, but he refused to marry her, even though the Pope at the time gave a papal dispensation saying that he could marry her. So you have this kind of strange story that we would consider sordid, and in many ways it is sordid, of this nun and this monk who got together and had children, and yet he was painting her as Mary. And this is a very, very controversial area and contentious to say this, but those pictures, those paintings of Mary done by Lippi are ethereal. They seem to reflect a sanctity and a beauty that's hard to imitate. So these are all areas that are not easy to look at, and they're kind of grey areas. But I think it's fascinating that Mary is so much in our consciousness and our lives. And this is really the point about the Mary pages, is that she finds us in our most sinful situations. Mary, as kind of God's little messenger, if you like, who comes to us in apparitions and visions and art, she will come to us wherever we are, however atheist we are, or however sinful, or in whatever muddle we might be. Those who have experienced Marian apparitions, they're often people at a crux in their lives who have no belief, or children who, don't know much about the catechism, like Bernadette at Lourdes. So, yeah, the book is really about looking at Mary and how she's a kind of, I call her a triage nurse in the hinterland between heaven and earth. And the number of Marian apparitions over the centuries, and particularly in the last 200 years, is absolutely astronomical. Somebody told me, actually, who works in the Vatican, that every week they receive hundreds of people saying that they've had an apparition of Mary. Now, of course, a proportion of those, perhaps a large proportion of those, will be people who are mentally unwell, or who are not reliable, who are looking for attention. But at the same time, some of those are real and genuine, and the Vatican will, be very, very careful about saying what is a real apparition and what isn't. I mean, they're incredibly scrupulous about that, which is why there's still this kind of question mark over Medjugorje to some extent. But nevertheless, I think it's fascinating that, in a sense, whatever the beginning, whatever the essence of those apparitions, I think it's fascinating that Mary as our mother is absolutely embedded in our consciousness. And it shows that we have a great need for this mother, and that when Jesus gave her to us as our mother on the cross, it was such a phenomenal gift. I mean, I was reflecting on this yesterday. It was such an amazing gift to be given a mother who is so available to us, and so almost tangible in the way that we view her. So yeah, that's my beginning, is how Mary came into my life and how available she is to all of us through all of these mediums.
So interesting. Thank you, Sally. Yeah, I see echoes there. Also grew up in a house with pictures of the Virgin Mary on the walls, and you're making me think about it in a new light, as I'm sure Sally's helping you to do if you're listening right now. And we're going on to have a look at some of your own Marian poetry, Sally. So thank you very much.
Yes, so I'll be returning to the Mary pages at the end, but in the meantime, I wanted to consider, as I said, I was talking about how when you walk through art galleries, you encounter Mary looking quite sort of flat and wooden in icons, but they seem to be kind of windows into something transcendent. And then you reach the paintings of Mary, which are much more earthy, and they were often, the Mary was painted from a model that was often the painter's lover, as is the case with Fra Lippi and with Caravaggio. And as a poet, I have long been fascinated by Mary, the ordinariness of Mary's experience and her pregnancy, because I know that we dwell a lot on how extraordinary it was. And of course, that's uniquely true. But also with Mary, she had the wonder and the extraordinariness of just what we all go through as mothers, which I find really comforting as a mother. And I think it teaches us a lot about her experience and her faith. And anyone who's been pregnant will know that it's a shocking and wondrous experience, and what happens to your body and what happens to your mind and your heart in those 9 months and obviously long afterwards it feels almost supernatural because you have so much strength, you have so much, or hopefully you do, you have so much love, and it feels like something is being written in you that you have no control over, which can be very scary. And of course, Mary had that times a million, because of the fact that she was carrying the Son of God. So yes, I wanted to read some poems about her pregnancy. And the first one is called The Quickening. And when you're pregnant at 16 weeks, you'll begin to feel the first stirrings of the child within you. They're just very tiny flickers. They're not strong kicks at that point. And it's called The Quickening. If prayer is a bare tree, clod-bound, yet reaching up with jagged branches to the boundless pasture of sky, think of her that day. His bare weight reached the tipping point, and she could feel him beat against the thickening of her flesh. Fleeting as a silver fish, there and gone as a firefly in the dusk. It's a feeling as scarce as your eyelash against your cheek, the lightest spasm of the eyelid. And she may have wondered if it was so, but there it was again. That day, Christ in utero found the softest boundaries of the world, and she knew, in the newest sense, the gravity-bound God that swam, the first touch of the divine to us. That flickering in her womb was like buds on the stark branches of our prayer, in what seemed unending silence, God's lips. Yeah, so that was The Quickening, and that's taken from my book, Dawn of This Hunger, and is really about, that first moment that somebody, i.e. Mary, perceived physically God in the world, which would have been when he was suddenly at that tiny, tiny, lightest weight where she would be able to sense him with her flesh. And of course, we know that Mary was walking in faith. She was walking in darkness. Her courage came through absolute faith. Aside from the Annunciation, we're not told of sort of mystical experiences. And we know from Scripture that she was, she treasured things in her heart. But she was anxious when she lost Christ and found him in the temple. And, it's not like she kind of knew everything. Although I guess divinely she had a sense of trust and a kind of a sense of what was unfolding within her. But at the same time, I guess, like any mother, when she first felt God within her, when she felt her son within her, that would have suggested things to her for the first time that were concrete, like, oh yes, what the angel said, this is really happening. It was the first time she could trust her senses. And I think as believers, we have a kinship with that, in the sense that Catholicism is so very physical. So although we have to walk in darkness and we have to walk in faith, when we go to Mass and we see the host and we are able to receive Christ physically, that's an enormous gift to us. That's not, it's kind of has a parallel with Mary's experience as physical mother to a physical son. Yeah, so I wanted to go on and read another poem about Mary as mother. And this one is called His Face. And this is really a nativity poem. And it's about when Christ was newborn and Mary was looking into his eyes for the first time. His face. His body is swaddled head to foot, but his face is a window, one small pool of light. This nakedness that even Adam would not cover is a tender dish of listening, hunger in the nuzzling nose and petal mouth, a sense of all in the here and now, and dizzy distance, like that one star announcing the expanse of night. Lady, see the depths of his dark eyes. This locked gaze is what keeps God and man together. It is true prayer. He holding fast to your face like a constellated sky. You tumbling softly into him with no lights but those eyes. Yeah, I guess, mothers will recognize when you hold your baby and look into their eyes when they're very little, there is this enormous connection of gaze. And, for Mary, that was absolutely the same as prayer. She was looking into the eyes of her maker and her son. So that's really attempting to capture that particular moment. And of course, apart from the Gospel of Luke, we don't hear too much about the infancy of Jesus. But again, as a poet, and I was working through the poems in Dawn of This Hunger, I was thinking a lot about the early days of Mary's motherhood and, having the baby grow up and how he would have toddled and walked and gone through all of those things that all children go through, and the enormous love she must have felt. And also, I guess, the sense of uncertainty that is very human, Mary was immaculate, as I say in the Mary pages, but she wasn't lobotomized. She must have felt some uncertainty, and she must have felt at least the shadow of fear. But in this poem, I'm looking at how, and this is from my own experience as a mother, with children, even though we're scared, there's something about a child that is so very right and so very beautiful that it reassures us and gives us courage, because they are fearfully and wonderfully made. And we collaborated with God to bring them about. So this is called The Rightness of the Child. A soft crazing of white blossoms makes sense of the bald sky. Look how his baby skin glows as he lies in your arms, watching them, like a lantern of apricot or plum in a tree's dark realm. He unfurled within you, and now he unfurls in your arms until he can walk far away. As a wild cherry is espaliered against its own wayward growth, he will only be stopped on the black agony of a cross. I wonder how much you wondered about that brute ending. Or do you, like any mother, consider all questions settled? In eyelashes fretted on his sleeping cheek, in the shine of his skin, in the uncanny command of his faultless blossoming. Yeah, so I guess we might have one more poem before we go to more music. Does that sound good?
That sounds great. Please.
I'll read a small one, and this is another nativity one. And this is a poem. I wrote this very shortly after my conversion, because as a poet, I was kind of blindsided by suddenly finding myself Catholic. And this is one of my very early ones. Song for the Newborn Christ. Heavy the cold air, gorgeous heavy her round arms. Then the pointillist creation of her smells, her milk, her hair. His own skin looses newborn scent, an altar that exhales incense. Thank God he's moored to her close voice. Her arms soak up the tremble of his earth-struck limbs. Oh, tiny, fragile, stricken ears, pricked to hear the story's end. My God, just let me love, she sings. Yeah, so that's looking at Mary's sort of earliest motherhood and the very obviously the very human nature of what she experienced in those days. So yeah, the Annunciation has been a big thing in my life, strangely enough. Apart from having all this Marian art in my life before I converted for many decades, I was always really fascinated by the Annunciation. I don't know why. I mean, I have no idea. I guess when I was sitting in the National Gallery as an atheist, I must have seen, well, I did. I saw lots of Annunciations. And in fact, probably one of my favourite paintings of all time is the Annunciation by Fra Lippi, which is just so achingly beautiful. It's so detailed, and it's in this beautiful frame and it's got a kind of an arched top bit. So Mary's head is bent and the angel's head is bent, and they're both kind of, the angel's kneeling and Mary's sitting low, and they're kind of contained in this sort of arc. And I just loved it so much. And by this point, I was actually a poet and was publishing books of poetry, and I was writing about the Annunciation. So In my first book of poetry, there was an Annunciation poem, and in my second book of poetry, plus numerous references to the Virgin Mary in many, many poems. And I just feel that with the Annunciation, I mean, obviously, it's a scene that's just embedded in our unconscious. It's kind of a union archetype, if you want to say it like that. It's something that even as a non-religious person, you're incredibly attracted to, because it is this meeting of God and man. And in pagan myth, we have the foreshadowing of that, with Zeus impregnating Leda and kind of many other kind of god and, pagan god and mankind meetings where they then give birth to something. So it's kind of always been within us. And Yeats wrote an amazing poem called Leda and the Swan, which is this kind of incredibly brutal, kind of violent encounter between Zeus and Leda. And so, that was very much kind of in me as a poet. And I would look at these Annunciation paintings and feel that there was just something so, it just felt like held breath. It was just this absolute moment where everything would kind of be decided. Even as a non-religious person, I felt that. And of course, before I was religious, I was always looking at, well, what happened at that point? What was Mary doing? Was it a love affair? Was she taken against her will? I felt compelled to find the truth of the story. And then when I converted, of course, I felt bad about the poems that I wrote, which in a sense I feel less bad now, because I think we're all on a journey, and I hope the people that encounter my early work will then follow on to my later work, and that's the way it goes, isn't it? So I wrote a couple of poems about the Annunciation for Dawn of This Hunger, which, by the way, you can get with Second Spring in the UK. Second Spring is a wonderful independent publisher run by Leonie Caldecott. She and her husband Stratford Caldecott, who's a theologian and writer at Oxford, they started Second Spring. So I do urge you to get in touch with them. So yes, this is Annunciation, and I will read it. Okay. The girl so still, a clutch of starlings might roost in her. Her 13 years and more are recollected in his gaze, as the purple blue of rosemary is lost in what is happening. Steady as earth she is, and soft, like turf penetrated by deep hooks of roots. How he watched her from the empty dawn of before all time. No gunshot would startle that stillness, or even make the birds around her fly. A prayer deep enough for God himself to tread, as though she were earth, and he, the weightless footfall, unused to gravity and human flesh, sighing into her consent. Yeah, so there are a couple of images there. One is of Mary as a tree where, birds could roost in her. She's so still. And then the other image is of Mary as turf or earth, somewhere that God could implant himself, where he could hook his roots and that he could tread on with his physicality. So this is really Mary as this place of immense stillness. And in my poetry, I use the image of Mary as a tree a great deal, which again to me is interesting because I was fascinated by paganism before I converted, like many, many years ago. And of course, trees are very, very important in the old pagan religions. And yet somehow that's maintained in me through seeing Mary as something that is so very grounded and so very, very still. And it's also taken up by, I would like to say who, but I can't remember, but I've come across in my reading the fathers of the church and various ancient poets that have also used tree imagery with regard to Mary. So it's always interesting as a poet when you come across imagery that you thought you'd made up, but actually it's been used many times before, and you realize you're tapping into something that's actually resonant with lots of other people. I think we've got time for another Annunciation poem. So this one is called What the Sparrow Saw. And this is about, I'm fascinated with birds as well as trees, actually. And I was thinking about, if there were any birds around during the Annunciation, like what would their reaction have been? What is an animal's reaction to to the transcendent, to the presence of the divine. It's like when Christ was crucified, and you talk about the day darkening and there being an earthquake, etc., etc. And I always imagine at moments like those that all the birds would fall completely silent. And I think that animals do have this sense, if you like, of something. In a sense, they're almost better than us at picking up on something strange happening. So this is really looking at that, that detail of the bird in the Annunciation. What the sparrow saw. In the long afternoon, dull with expected sunlight, is it possible that a bird nearby would not be changed at its scorched wingtip or in its jagged gaze by what it witnessed? Would it have seen the angel or just the staggered girl holding her own hands? Would she have been so still that he rested for a moment on her arm, like a winter branch but soft? Or would he have jittered, flitted at the immense bodiless made present, like a sunset on the doorstep, a tsunami in the barn? And if his breast feathers were warmed, shaken harder by his minuscule heart, if his eyes contained then a moment's intense knowledge at what was near, or even a crazed bird madness, what deep hope for me as I kneel before your presence. Yeah, so the last line there is really talking about, how when we come before the Blessed Sacrament in adoration, we cannot fail to be transformed, even if we don't sense it, even if we don't feel it. I always think about sitting before the Blessed Sacrament as being like sitting before the sun, which I think somebody else has also said. Was it John Paul II? I can't remember. When you sit before the Blessed Sacrament, you will be warmed and you will be tanned. You will be changed by what you are standing in front of. Everything is changed in the world by the presence of Christ. Everything is changed by the sacrifice of the Mass. Another of the Church Fathers said that, every time the sacrifice of the Mass is made, something changes in heaven and on earth, which I think is so, so true. So, the Annunciation for me has been a pivotal passage of Scripture. And I actually wrote a book that was published by Ignatius Press called Annunciation, A Call to Faith in a Broken World. And I took apart in that book the Bible verses of Luke that make up the Annunciation. And the book is written to my daughter, who at the time was 10 going on 11 and had just received her first communion and was beginning to sort of ask questions and be very skeptical about various things. And I wanted to really explain to her, why faith was so important. And it all came through an analysis and a meditation on the Annunciation and Mary's response to the angel. And it ended up being a kind of a reflection on anxiety and on suffering and on how we accept God into our lives and how that will transform us. So the Annunciation has always been something very, very important to me.
I just wanted to say, you mentioned at the beginning about when you were talking about Fra Lippi and his relationship with Lucrezia, which led to these incredible paintings, and that grey area that causes. And it kind of reminded me of the very famous and miraculous image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, when Our Lady appeared as a half-caste in that image, which was very much shocking at the time, and bringing together those two cultures, the indigenous people and those who'd kind of come to conquer and convert. So really, as it was wonderful the way you pointed that out so clearly, that Mary goes to those places which are uncomfortable and brings peace and unity. We've got a few more minutes, so I know you want to share a bit more with us, so back over to you.
Okay, yeah, so I thought I would, the Mary pages are split up into different sections, and each one, Word on Fire, have done a lovely job of the book, as they always do. It's beautiful. And the beginning of each section, there is a Marian image. And in the penultimate section, it's the Pietà by Michelangelo, because the Pietà, which is in the Basilica of St. Peter's, is really a very important image for me. And I saw it a couple of times before I converted and was incredibly struck by its power and its pain and all the rest of it. And I wrote a poem about it that was in my second book of poetry, which I put out when I was an atheist. And as a mother, I felt that sculpture kind of within me, when there was a problem with my daughter or she was unwell, I felt it so viscerally. Once again, it's one of those images that transcends your own beliefs, transcends where you think you're at a particular point in time. It speaks to something deep within our souls. So I wanted to read you just a small passage from the Merry Pages about Michelangelo's Pietà. In this, the heart's image, mother and son are one marble pyramid. Her head, the vertex, the rock of Golgotha, the base. Despite the realism, the muscles, the fingernails, the veil, Mary here is disproportionately large. No normal-sized woman could cradle her dead son that way. Jesus has given up the ghost. His face is bloodless and serene. And this outsized virgin is the receiving world. Her arms and fingers are long and tapered as branches that seem to have caught him in a precipitous fall from on high. In Robert Hupke's photograph of this masterpiece, taken from above, this sheer fall is captured. We see that Christ has descended, plumb as a stone dropped into a lake, or an orange from a tree to the earth. As we walk around them, this entwined mother and son, we see that the Virgin's hands say two things. One catches him, grasps him, possesses him, knows that without her, he will fall from the knowable world. But the left hand gestures, what is this? It is this hand that speaks to God, like Esther's plea. Help me, who am alone and have no helper but you. Like Job's lament, why is light given to one in misery? And like her own song, my soul magnifies the Lord. The left hand says, this, meaning, this is everything, all love, all sacrifice, all pain, all question and all answer. Yes, her lap is wide. She can take anything, the world's sorrow, even though at such cost, him. This scene is the interface of God's pain and the world's rage, the world's pain and God's rage, God's love and the world's need, the world's love and God choosing heart-wrenchingly to need. It is an intolerable sight cast in marble. It is the only sight. Yeah, so that's in the penultimate section of the Mary Pages, where as a young mother, I was very drawn to the Pietà and to the image of Mary as mother and to how she received Christ's pain in that way. And of course, as a believer, the image became even more important. I find, Mary, Mother of Sorrows, we have Mary so joyful, if you like, for the Magnificat, the Annunciation and the Magnificat. Then as we travel through, we have Mary as somebody who is the receiver of Christ's pain and the witness of Christ's pain. And if you like, as all mothers are, we're all kind of called as mothers to digest our children's pain or to hold on to it. And that's what children do. I mean, even in the everyday, your kid will come to you and they'll tell you all about how terrible school was and who was picking on them and how horrible the teacher is. And then you feel terrible. And then they skip away and they're kind of on with their lives. But the mother is the receptacle for all of those things. And Mary is kind of our model for motherhood, with her immense love and her immense calm and her immense compassion. And so I wanted to read a poem actually from Dawn of This Hunger, which is called The Mother. And it was written in response to a novel by Colm Tóibín, who's a wonderful Irish writer, called The Testament of Mary. And he kind of reimagines Mary's story and says that, Christ was crazy and Mary knew that, and it was kind of embarrassing and dangerous for her. And so when it came to to the crucifixion, Mary ran away because she did not want to be killed by the Romans or to be punished by the Romans. And this poem is my response to that. The Mother. A man once hypothesized that Mary ran from the cross to save her own skin. Surely he was blind to these things. Christ, as a blasted tree, fused black against the sky, scourged, slashed, stabbed, and his mother as the deep roots beneath him. How could she go? She was the earthed wire of his agony, rooting his pain to the earth's marrow. The ground will never stop singing, nor our bones if they'll listen. Our children hurt and they cry. We carry their grief in our frames like a new kind of gravity. Understand, you who doubt this love, or the grit to bear it. The long fields are ready for running, and many do run. But like those fields, seeded thoroughly with yellow everlastings, she is the ground of his life, the shell of his sounding. There is nowhere else she could be. Yeah, so that's kind of my defense of Mary, if you like. I think that there's a terrible kind of blasphemy that goes on in our culture in the defacements of Mary, which you see a lot in art. I mentioned Chrysophilia earlier, who'd made a portrait of Mary made out of elephant dung. And it's not attractive, you know. I mean, it's not an attractive portrait at all. She looks kind of ugly and stupid and dumb. And Munch as well, Edvard Munch, painted a portrait of Mary where she looks sort of sexualized and contemptuous. And it feels to me as a woman that this kind of this particular kind of blasphemy is an affront to religion and to Mary, but also to all mothers. You know, I think that Mary is our greatest example, and we need to make sure that she is defended and upheld and revered. You know, I think that the loss of Mary in our culture is one of the reasons things have gone wrong in so many different ways.
I don't think the Blessed Virgin Mary could have chosen anyone better than to defend her this morning on her birthday. So thank you so much, Sally, for opening up and sharing with us all these, your intimate relationship with Mary and its dawnings in the beginning of your life. Let's just remind you of the books that publications that Sally has mentioned today, available, of course, in all the usual places. Sally's literary memoir, The Mary Pages, An Atheist's Journey to the Mother of God, and then poetry Dawn of This Hunger, published by Second Spring, and also Annunciation, A Call to Faith in a Broken World. These aren't your only publications, are they, Sally?
No, and my website is Sally Reed, that's Sally READ, sallyreed.net, and all the books are on that page if you want to find out more about them. And also, just to plug myself here, but I am also a teacher of poetry, so if anybody is a budding poet and they would like some sessions reading and writing poetry, then I am available.
Thank you so much, and you can contact Sally through us here at Radio Maria. We've run out of time, and it's wonderful the way you mentioned that, you know, this sorrow as well, because we go from the birthday next week into the feast of Our Lady of Sorrows. So I'm sure we'll have more time to reflect on all of this with you, because Sally will be back on Radio Maria next month. And so if anything springs to mind in the meantime, do write it down and ask Sally next time she's on Radio Maria. And Sally also mentioned to me how she just had a wonderful little pilgrimage to the Catholic shrine of Our Lady of Walsingham. So let's just finish by invoking Our Lady's intercession by saying, Our Lady of Walsingham, pray for us. Our Lady of Sorrows, pray for us.
This was a Radio Maria podcast. If you enjoyed it, do please click like and subscribe on your podcast provider, or leave us a review. Every bit of feedback helps increase our visibility and allows us to reach more people with the message of Christ's saving truth.